Welcome to the journey home. My guest this evening, Kristen McGuire's story reminds us that God uses all different kinds of people and experiences, situations in the lives of people to bring them on their journey home. All of our journeys in some sense are very similar, but in the main details, God specifically designs the people, the places, the situations to get our attention, to draw us closer to Him. And Kristen's journey reminds us of that. When I asked her earlier the theme for tonight's story, she very quickly said that she wanted it entitled A Beggar at the Table, because the way that the Lord touched her heart had a lot to do with working with the poor, as a reminder of our need to be reaching out like Jesus to Jesus, as we find Jesus in the lives and hearts of others. We're going to talk about that tonight, and the importance not only that of our lives, but how it opened her heart to the Catholic Church. Remember, you're an important part of this program, as you are every week. This is a live program. We could easily tape it every week, but it's live because you are a part of the program, for you to submit your questions about the journey. So if you'd like to send a question by phone, call us at 1-800-221-9460, or if you'd like to email us, you can at journeyhome@ewtn.com. Kristen, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you.
You know, when I told my boys that my guest was going to be Kristen McGuire, my three sons, of course, had one quick question. Are you related to a baseball star?
No, but everyone does ask.
Is that? Because they were hoping to get some free tickets. Or
Well.
I guess I'll have to disappoint them.
Yeah.
But you've been a part of the Coming Home Network that I direct from its beginning, haven't you?
Quietly, but
That's
yes.
right.
But it was a real relief to find the Coming Home Network, because there, I think, was a point where I felt weird.
Yeah.
Which
is the case for so many of us.
Yeah.
And most of the primary members of the Coming Home Network, the apostolate that I direct, are Protestant clergymen who convert to the Catholic Church. And you're one of those few clergy women? Or you didn't quite, did you become?
I didn't actually finish the ordination track. There came a point, which we'll talk about later, where I said, don't call me, I'll call you.
The Lord was working in your life. Well, as we begin every week, I ask you to fill in the background to your journey by helping the audience understand where you came from spiritually.
Okay. I was really fortunate to come from a family of faith. My family is Methodist, and my mother made us go, and father both united together, made us go to church every week. And there was that time in my teens where I thought, oh, I don't want to, but they stuck with it, and they made clear that God is important, and that was a huge gift. And they also made clear that we have an obligation to the less fortunate. So I started there, went to college, and, well, like so many people, I really started a very hedonistic lifestyle, but at the same time was doing a lot of social justice and social action work. I worked at a pregnancy aid clinic, and I worked tutoring children in the inner city, and I worked at homeless shelters and soup kitchens all through the city of Washington, D.C., where I was. And, was very active. I think that the big change began when a friend of mine tried to commit suicide. And it was just a very traumatic experience for a young woman. And it just made me ask that first question, why am I here? Who am I? And I don't know if I related it so much to the social justice work at the time. But then, as time went on, I had a big epiphany where the Lord appeared to me, and I was asleep in my dorm room, and I woke up and realized that God was asking me to serve Him. And I laugh now because, when I told my father about this experience, he laughed out loud. He said, we have a long way to go. But the point was that I had this experience that God wanted me to serve Him. And so that began this strange walk backwards looking, and I never really thought about looking for Him in the poor, but I still was very active, but starting to burn out about the same time. I think He came to me because He knew I was going to the shelters and I would pour myself into it. I was being good and I was helping the needy. I was doing really good things, but there was nothing feeding the work. So, I'm fast forwarding a little bit as time went on.
Your response to that vision, was that what gave you the desire to go to the seminary?
Yeah. I mean, really, in a nutshell, I started looking at seminary brochures and trying to figure out which ones wouldn't make me go to church very much. And, really, I was probably the only person in the history of Protestant seminarians who was trying to figure out how to get out of the church part. I just wanted to serve. So, as time went on, I met my future husband, and he's a cradle Catholic, and I think he was a little frightened that perhaps I had a real vocation in the Catholic sense of the word, that God wanted me to be a nun, and he really pushed me. He said, "You must go to seminary. You must settle this with God, so that because we really were head over heels in love, and I think his fear was, what if she wakes up and decides she's supposed to be a nun in 10 years after 3 kids or something?" So. In seminary, I was a real intellectual. I mean, there was an intellectual faith, and then there also was a real active element of, working at the shelters. So I met this woman who changed everything. Just a few weeks before my wedding to my husband, she had gotten kicked out of the shelter for using drugs. But she'd given me a phone number where she could be reached, and I just felt this compulsion to call her. It had to be the Holy Spirit. And we sat on the phone talking for 2 hours about how much God loved her. And I was just so full of trying to help. And in the end, she was the one who helped me. She was the one who pulled me in. She says at the end of this long conversation, "Kristen, I really love you. Do you love me?" And I did not know what to say. It was so sad. I had no idea whether I loved her or not, and I didn't want to be dishonest. And in a panic, I just said, "Yes, I love you." And thinking, well, she can't see my face. But about maybe 3 or 4 weeks after that, I'm driving down the road in a pouring rain, and all of a sudden this vision of Jesus with Sharon's face back and forth came before me. And, I can't say, but that I realized it was Jesus. And Jesus came to me, and this poor beggar on the street, and he says, "I really love you. Do you love me?" And of course I love him. Of course. And that's where everything changed. And I wasn't so much of an intellectual Christian. I wasn't out to save the world through my intellectual and abilities, but I was starting to understand that Jesus is the Savior.
And in that experience,
yeah,
he was speaking through the poor,
yeah,
to get you to confirm your faith. And our topic for tonight, as we talked about, is this issue of our social action, our reaching out to the needy. And at that point in your journey, if you look back, you came to understand social action in a different way, but how had you understood it in relationship to faith at all before? I mean, it's an interesting dichotomy that you had there.
Yeah, there was a disconnect, right? I don't think I was relating what I was doing in the shelters with any other part of my life, and certainly the spiritual part of my life, I didn't understand. It's almost as though I could see it, but I couldn't touch it. And so when I look back at that time in my life, I think, the bottom line is that I wanted to serve, but in order to serve, I needed Jesus. Yeah. To really serve, because otherwise I would just be serving me. That was what I was doing, to make up for some of the hedonistic things I was doing.
Was it a form of works righteousness?
Yeah, I think so.
So you were doing this to feel better, or to justify, or to maybe win yourself closer to God, and even Jesus was a means rather than an end.
Yeah.
And that Jesus was the means. to make you feel better about yourself. And then you had this powerful conversion to Jesus.
Yeah.
What did it do to your social action at that point?
Ooh. Well, yeah, in a sense, it marked a big change because that was the time of my marriage, and I got pregnant almost immediately after that, and so it was the beginning of my motherhood. But it also, I think, I would say, is the beginning of my spiritual maternity. So that the next summer, I was pregnant, but I worked as a chaplain intern at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and I don't think that's what they call it now. It's a mental hospital. But that was the real, that was where everything got put to the test.
So what's interesting as we hear the story is that we could see how the Lord was touching your life in a variety of ways to get your attention, but not in a hurry.
No.
Being very patient with you and your own timing.
Mm-hmm.
And interesting, gets you into service. Many people, they have the faith experience, then you got to kick them to get them out there and help the poor. Well, you're out helping the poor, and in the process, he helped you discover him.
Mm-hmm. Well, fools rush in where
But
angels fear to tread.
Yes, and he gets you in this other place then,
Yeah.
right? And this is where your heart gets kind of touched for the Catholic faith?
Yeah. Well, it was so overwhelming. We were assigned to 3 different wards: the acute care ward, the chronic care ward, and I had a geriatric ward that I went in. Part of the job was to write up the intake religious assessment of mental patients, and you had to really open yourself to the person and do your best to get some kind of a understanding. And there were very dangerous people there. There were very confused people there. And you always had to be careful not to be projecting yourself. It was such an emptying experience for me, and I was pregnant with our first child. So there were all these questions of identity and what does God want me to do? Where am I going to be going with this? And there had always in the background been quite a few theological, I'm not so sure that I think that this is everything. There was a lot of that. I always say I got enough good theology in my undergrad years at Georgetown University that when I got to the seminary, there were a few warning signs. So, in that all...
You were at a Protestant seminary.
Yeah, I was at a Protestant seminary. So, in a nutshell, I was confronted by several people who were very violent and was just a quivering mass for several weeks, unable to function, and I kept feeling drawn to the altar. I would go into the chapel very early, and after work I would be back in there, and I was reading a lot of Mother Teresa at the time because I just kept looking at her saying, she has faith and she does such beautiful works for God. She's got them connected. How does she do that? And I think even in my intellectual pride, I thought to myself, maybe if I just figure out how she did that, I would be the greatest Methodist theologian, and all of a sudden it dawned on me at the end of the summer, wait a minute, that's not Mother Teresa's theology, that's Catholic theology, So I think I pretty much knew at the end of that summer. I had one more year at the Protestant seminary, but I just had such a hunger for the incarnate Lord. He touched me in the poor. And, my husband brought me to Mass every week. He would go to the Protestant services, and we would go to Mass. And how can you not know? I needed him.
It's still a jump.
Yes.
From being in Methodist seminary to being drawn to the incarnate Lord in the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, how long did it take, and what was maybe some of the hurdles that you had to go over?
Well, I think the first...
Because you had this internal conversion,
yeah.
right? The heart conversion.
There weren't huge hurdles, but I think that there was a certain joy that attended it for me. I mean, in many respects, I'm very lucky. My husband was a cradle Catholic. He was thrilled. And, I did have to get through that last year of seminary, and I think not unlike a lot of younger women today, I had to decide, there's motherhood here, which is a huge vocation, and then there's all this training that I've done. Is that going to go to waste if I give all of my energies to this child and now children? And so I think that was the bigger hurdle to get over in my mind, was to take what God had given me and put it to use. And I guess that's why I really keep focusing on the point of being a beggar at the table, because I did feel like a beggar, and I do many times still now feel like a beggar at the table. I go in there and I just am amazed at what he's done and what I know he can do and what he will do. And so I just, I don't know if it was a hurdle.
Well, I'm sure going from Methodist theology to Catholic theology was a few hurdles that you had to work through. But it's interesting that maybe the Lord greased the chutes for you in the sense of your love for the poor. I mean, he opened a natural door, especially giving you the model of Mother Teresa.
Yes.
As a kind of an enticement.
Well, and there's a huge Marian element there on the Catholic side. I guess I wouldn't say it's a hurdle, but the big difference between the Kristen who was in Methodist Seminary and the Kristen who is a Catholic is that understanding that we don't do social justice, or we do not engage ourselves in social action to feel good, or it's not even simply doing God, doing the good works for God, being a channel. We are a channel of grace, but it's even more than that, that he forms us, that he touches us, that he loves us in that way. And it changes, I think, over time it has completely changed the way that I view other people, from beggars on the street up to,
When we mention social action, we get all kinds of reactions, some very negative, because there's a lot of interpretations of social action. As we listen to your own story, we almost see at least 3 different kinds of social action in your own journey.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a social action that was totally detached from faith. Faith is a foundation. I mean, the idea that you can be out there feeding the poor but have no clue who Jesus really is.
Yeah.
2, trying to put it together. How do you make the balance? 2, finding out that that's what faith is.
Yeah.
Is working with the poor. Talk a bit about, as you pick the title of beggar at the table, talk a bit about how you understand now as a Catholic the place of social action in our faith.
I see it as an overflowing cup. But in order for the cup to overflow, it has to be filled from somewhere. And it's God who does the filling. And so that means that our job is the emptying, is the receiving, is the sitting down in the midst of a situation and looking to see where we will be sent, rather than plunging in and choosing to solve the problem, which doesn't always address the real issues. And there's also a lot of peace in that. And I think of Mother Teresa going through Calcutta, picking up dying bodies, but peacefully. There is so much peace. I don't know how many of the missionaries of charity you've met, but all of the sisters have such a peace, and they have such a beautiful laughter within their vocation, so that the joy of knowing Jesus extends in a very concrete way. And so that there's really no comparison between the two.
Interesting thinking again on your journey when you had that first communication with Christ and he was calling you to serve. Given the theological environment that you were in, the only option was seminary.
Yeah.
Okay? In Protestant world, that's when you're going to serve the Lord full time, it's seminary or it's the mission field. But as a Catholic, it's a little different, really.
Yeah.
The call to service is for everyone, isn't it?
It is.
Talk a little bit about the call. How does a layperson understand their call to social action?
I think it's always best for a layperson to start where they are and with who they are. And we have to accept who we are and what we are capable of. And some people don't have the talent to go into a homeless shelter and sit with the people, and receive them. But to take a good example from Mother Teresa, she had a very rich Indian woman who wanted to give lots of money, and she refused to let her, but she allowed her every month. She would buy a brand new sari, and they cost 800 rupees. Every month, she took 100 rupees off the price of the sari that she bought. So she would buy a lesser quality one, even though she was quite well off, and she would give the extra money to the missionaries of charity. And she kept on going. I think she made her stop at 100 rupees so that she could not give any less. You know, she had to. But it was a very sensitive way for her to help, because giving out of what we care about, giving of ourselves, is a lot more difficult than maybe sitting down and writing a check, perhaps. That for some families, that's a sacrifice. But for many, it's not. And so to really give of ourselves, because that is what we can give to Jesus that matters.
Part of it is discerning what are the gifts, specific gifts that Christ has given us, in recognizing that where we are is where God has planted us, and our families are the family that God has given us, and our friends are the friends that God has given us. And the Catholic teaching on lay apostolates, the apostle of the laity, calls us to examine right where we are is the front line of the ministry of the church, because we are in contact with people that maybe can only be reached through our words and through our love, that a priest or a nun or a monk, a bishop, a cardinal could never reach in the way that we are. And the danger is that we think, boy, if I were a missionary in New Guinea, boy, what could I do?
Yeah. Well, it almost seems easier. I mean, really, in some sense, as I look back at the times when I would spend a lot of time in the shelter, it probably was less so later on because I was letting Jesus help me. But certainly in the beginning, there was a wall between me and those people, and I was happy to let it stay there. I was doing good, and I went down there and I did good for those people, but I was not allowing it to touch my heart. And so it was a false relationship, and that's a real big danger when you do social action projects. You know, not that they're not important and good. I mean, I think it's better to go and to serve the poor. If you have the opportunity to go and serve the needy, to refuse to do it just because you don't think you have the right spiritual state of mind is not the right response. The correct response is to ask Jesus to help you as you do it.
That's right. This kind of work is not an option, because we have confusion about what social action is, and sometimes it's seen as a negative sense in that some will say the social gospel versus the gospel, when in reality is the gospel of faith involves charity together. The necessity. Talk a bit about why it is absolutely essential that we look for ways to live out our faith in our present situation.
Well, I think it has to do with God's goodness and God's love. A love continuously grows and breeds goodness, or it dies. And so if our love for Jesus is not growing, is not being fed by that constant giving out of little things, then it begins to die a little, and maybe we don't see it so much, but we close ourselves off to certain people, or we close ourselves off to certain things. And I mean, a perfect example is when I, notice on TV when there's lots of shooting and killing and all that thing, we start to close our minds to the idea that these are all people with immortal souls. And so it's little things like that I think, maybe illustrate that goodness brings us to where God plans for us to be.
If you entitled this "The Beggar at the Table," then you probably reflected on the importance of understanding suffering in the midst of social action. And I think from a Catholic perspective, I believe that's what makes it different than social action outside of a Catholic perspective.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the importance of suffering, or understanding suffering in the midst of social action.
Well, I think that one of the things that makes suffering very difficult for us to handle just in our own situations is that we, as much as we believe that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead and that being baptized into his death, we shall rise again. There is still the blunt fact that as we sit in our homes today, there's this here, right now, here's the kingdom right now as it exists in my heart, which is very imperfect, and there's the second coming of Christ that is the very real fulfillment of our hopes. And sometimes when we get involved in social action, we forget that our hope rests in the second coming, and that some problems cannot be completely solved in the here and now, and to be patient with that within ourselves, and also to be models of how to suffer in a way that is redemptive. We can take it out of the bitterness of self-pity and try to anesthetize ourselves from it, or we can ask Jesus to suffer in and through us so that we are indeed anesthetized, but in a different way.
If you were to pick a gospel story that might be a favorite one to you, that might describe your understanding of this need to reach out, do you have a favorite?
Oh, I love the story of the blind man in John 9, where first he comes upon the blind man, and the disciples all say to him, well, Rabbi, who was it, this man's parents, or was it he himself that brought this upon him? And he says, no, but that this is an opportunity for the glory of God to shine through. And then he heals them, and no one believes that this is something that is also a spiritual. This is a spiritual transformation as well as a physical transformation. So,
yeah, they get involved in the polemics.
Yeah, they do. They're
They
all
miss
like,
the guy.
that's not really him. It's you.
Oh, yeah, and as if they solve that problem, then they solve, oh, it's his parents. Okay, good. Now we can move on. What about the guy?
Yeah.
And I think it's in James that talks about if someone is in need and you say you have faith, right? It's not enough to just say, go along and get better. I forget how the text goes. But we have to reach out and care. And to me, the avoidance of social action, as much as it's theologized, is the avoidance of the uncomfortable in our lives. Because by getting involved with needy people, you're inviting the hurts and pains of the world into your life. And so it's easy to theologize, come up with the reasons why I don't have to do good works, because I only have to have faith alone. But the reality is, not only is it a part of our faith, but this idea of redemptive suffering is that good old theology of offering it up. That when we experience the pain of others, we're sharing in the sufferings of Christ.
And certainly there are times, for example, I'm living in a time right now when I'm not able to do the social justice work that I'd like to. I have 5 children. They're, very young. And I don't think they're ready to go down to the shelter yet. We'll serve that way someday, but this is not the right time.
Now, during the break, you are a freelance writer, besides being a mom of 5, and still spending what time you can working with the poor and other options. But you're also an author to a book called The Glory to be Revealed in You, a spiritual companion to pregnancy. Yeah. Talk a bit about that. How did that come about?
Well, that was the fruit of being a beggar at the table the first few years in the church. I was pregnant several times in the course of my conversion, and so the theme of conversion as well as pregnancy sort of united in my mind, and I began to reflect quite a bit on what becoming a mother had done for me spiritually. And so the meditations in that book
are from your experience during the time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, during the break, you'll see information about the book if you're interested in finding out about that. But please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment with Kristen with your questions as we talk about being beggars at the table. Welcome back to the Journey Home. My guest this evening, Kristen McGuire, who's not the sister of Mark McGuire, as some have thought, but is here talking about how the Lord used her willingness to reach out to the poor, to touch her heart, first to have a very powerful experience of conversion to Jesus, to have an intimacy with Christ, which then continued to feed her own work with the poor, which helped her recognize, I guess the way to put it, the void that was in your heart that needed to be full. You saw it modeled in the life of Mother Teresa. When what's she got that I ain't got?
That's right.
There's something there. And, you know, I've often heard people who aren't Catholics who love Mother Teresa but don't realize that her Catholicism was essential to who she is.
Yes.
They might say, I like Mother Teresa, but I don't like what she believes.
Or they even criticize her pro-life stance just because they don't agree with it. And you know, it's really amazing how but we all do this. Sometimes we compartmentalize what we believe so that it serves not having to make a really tough sacrifice.
Have you found in coming to the church that the Catholic Church's positions on social issues is a seamless garment?
Yes. If you take the time to really analyze the entirety of where it's coming from, and sometimes that's unfair because there's a lot of theological documents, you know, that I maybe would go through and look at, but you know, of a piece, it always goes back to the one verse in the Bible that Mother Teresa is always pointed to, which was in Matthew, I think, 25, where it says, you know, if you get to the door of heaven, if you did not feed the hungry, how does it say? I never can prove text to save my life.
Right.
If you don't, you know, when I was hungry and you did not feed me, I was thirsty and you did not give me drink, I was in prison and you did not visit me.
That's right. And the Catholic teaching from feeding the poor to respecting the child in the womb, to respecting life all the way to the end of life is a seamless understanding. And the danger is picking and choosing.
Yeah.
You know, which ones I like, which ones I don't like. And the reality is it breaks the whole garment.
Yeah, it does.
And so let's take our first caller. Hello, what's your name and where are you from?
My name is Joan, and I live in Duluth, Minnesota.
Hello, Joan. What's your
Hi.
question for us tonight?
Well, I would like to know if Kristen found it easy to accept the authority of the Catholic Church because she first accepted the authority of Jesus in her life.
Good question.
Yeah. I think that the unfortunate state of Protestant theology, maybe it's just the American impulse, I'm not sure, but there's an awful lot of picking and choosing that goes on. And if you think about it from a Protestant standpoint, even though I had accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, what that meant in practical terms in my everyday life, if I didn't like what they taught in the Methodist Church, I could become a Presbyterian if that was closer, or, you know, any one of the many hundreds of other sects. So it really was not so much a leap on that count, but a leap of understanding that in submitting what I did not completely understand, I also was then not the one who was primarily responsible for making sure it was true, and I found that to be a huge relief. And at the same time, to discover on so many points the pro-life questions, on the death penalty, on the justice that between nations, I was quite amazed that the church really, it seems to me, has hit it exactly on balance, that even in a democracy, we have a danger of being so materialistic that we lose what that freedom has gained for us.
Yeah, there are many different views. This is a good question. And to begin, first of all, with accepting the authority of Jesus in the Protestant world, I mean, understanding what that means as a direct call into our life is there's so many views on that, because, like you said, a person can be a very committed in one denomination, but when that denomination rubs them the wrong way, then they have the total freedom to go somewhere else. Well, where is the authority? Mm-hmm. And how do they know if it's Jesus calling them, or their own conscience, or their own lack of conscience? Mm-hmm. or the impulses of other voices in the culture, or their flesh calling them in another direction. Where's the authority? So, but I think as I listened to your journey, you heard Christ calling you to serve, and you served. All right? So there was an acceptance of some authority. You didn't know yet where, but there was a part of obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe your motives weren't the best, but there was an aspect of obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And then in time, it was Christ helping understand the authority behind that obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still growing, right?
Yeah. Obedience is a very, very difficult issue.
You still go to confession?
Oh, yeah.
In other words, we're on a journey, right?
That's right.
I mean, learning to understand obedience and authority.
Yeah.
Let's take our first email. This is also from Minnesota, from Julian. It says, Dear Marcus and Kristen, thank you for considering this. Kristen, I too went to a Methodist seminary, but am not a Catholic. And one reason is that I don't understand what appears to be this most unbiblical notion of Christ being found in the poor. Don't the poor need Christ? The poor surely are not saved and made saints by virtue of their poverty, are they? We are saved by grace through faith, and that not of ourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Ephesians 2:8-9. Applies to the poor too, doesn't it?
Trying to think what the best starting point to unpack that is. I think it all goes back to the cross. Jesus, in taking on the suffering of the cross, redeemed us. And one of the recurrent meditations I had when working at St. Elizabeth's was that the pain of the body of Christ became the promise of eternal salvation, so that suffering is not a meaningless activity. It can be something that will make you bitter if you do not unite yourself with Jesus in your suffering and ask Him to be with you. But I have found in my own personal life and in working with many people who suffer, unfortunately, it seems that suffering is part of life. So either we unite ourselves with Christ and thereby taste the promise through our suffering, or we struggle in it and we rail against it, and it does not feed our soul, because the soul is not the soul and the body are united completely. And it's not that the soul drags the body kicking and screaming. I think it's more that the body needs the guidance of the soul.
This man's question reminds me that whenever you get into any of these areas, there isn't just one point of theology that needs to be touched. There are so many different understandings of suffering, different understanding of the purpose and place of the poor in a society, the different callings that we have. A rich man has a different calling and a different responsibility and a different expectation from God than a poor man. And different responsibilities one to another, the poor to the rich and the rich to the poor, the different responsibilities. And even another level that as I hear that question, and that is that sadly, even in the church, there are people who do social action, but they haven't got it all together. Sometimes those involved in mission works are out doing good social deeds, but their theology isn't the best. And so maybe they think that I'm saving the poor by providing them blankets and not teaching them about Jesus Christ. And so that's where you get the bad name of social gospel. But the reality is that seeing Christ in the poor is exactly biblical, because you gave the verse in Matthew 25 when Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats. That there'll come a time, and in fact the most clearest verse in Scripture, one of the clearest, where Christ talks about the final judgment. He doesn't mention faith there. He mentions how we lived out our faith in charity, whether we helped or didn't help, whether we fed or didn't fed, because he says, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. Now, if that means seeing Jesus not just in the poor, but in everyone in our lives. We need to recognize that everyone in our life is our mission field. Everyone.
And that's an excellent place to start, because if you can receive your family members in true charity, and in true charity that will say, no, that's not true. Yeah. That doctrine that you hold to is not true, which does not change my love for you. That's the beginning of being able to go to the poor and to struggle with them.
That verse that was also mentioned, Ephesians 2, I think it was 8 and 9, which talked about being saved through faith and grace, and that's exactly the teaching of the church. But often that verse is quoted against the Catholic Church. That's exactly what we believe by being saved by faith through grace. Everything we are and receive and able to do is grace. But often the next verse isn't quoted, which says that we are created to do the good works that God gave us to do. That is the outpouring and the infleshing of our faith.
And the other thing to remember is that the actual fact of sin and disease and pestilence all stems from original sin. So that when we are, in a sense, with the poor, working to change their lot, it is not necessarily the case that we should seek to eliminate all sins from their lives. That's not our job, because we're not the Messiah.
Yeah. Let's take our next call. This is Jimmy from New Jersey. Hello, Jimmy. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi, Marcus. I want to know, how do you turn your cheek without becoming a doormat?
Good question.
That's a wonderful question.
You run. No.
I really believe in that receptive Marian element wherein you receive from God a call to go forward. And then when you are sent and someone slaps your cheek, that becomes the will of God. And then He helps you turn the other cheek. Now, in a practical sense, because I have seen situations where churches have helped, and then it's turned out that these were felons who were fleeing 3 straight state troopers, etc. There comes a point where I think it is okay to be a fool for the Lord if you can offer that from the joy of your heart. But if you are sitting back and weighing the situation and hemming and hawing, and it clearly is not something that you can give out of an overflowing cup, then you're not really serving on God's grace. You are not allowing Him to help you serve. You're serving yourself. And it's time to go back to the receptive stage.
I remember from my work as a pastor being a doormat often, because it was hard for me to say no whenever someone came to the parish door beforehand. And it was not ever easy. And I don't know that I have a good formula for that. But when I looked back after a while, I realized that maybe part of my problem was I wasn't maybe doing what the situation really needed. You see, someone would come and ask, can you give me $5 and give some reason? And he may be totally false. Well, my easy solution would be give him $5.
Yeah.
And my question was he going to use it for food? Is he going to use it for something else? Mm-hmm. But maybe what the person needed was so much more than a quick $5. Mm-hmm. Maybe we need to find out about this person. What else does this person need? Are there connections I can make for this person? Maybe the church needs to get services together to help people. In other words, we got to look at the bigger picture than the quick fix. And I believe it's in the quick fixes where we get taken as doormats more often than when we look at the bigger picture and the impact that we can have as a church and working together. And sadly, our culture has a lot of quick fixes. Yeah. And we have a whole group of our culture that have learned to live on the quick fixes. Mm-hmm. Let's take this next email. This is from Livermore, California. This is from Rod Federal. Hello, Marcus and Kristen. My question has to do with a problem that Kristen alluded to earlier in the program. People want to be active in social issues, but tend to compartmentalize their lives so as to pick and choose what they will believe in. In Northern California, where I live, there seems to be this perception that social justice is the exclusive, quote, bailiwick of the so-called liberal establishment, both in the country as a whole and the church in particular. Has Kristen experienced this attitude, and what would she suggest as a way to counteract it? Love the show.
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy within the church. there is a certain amount of what they would call cafeteria Catholicism, perhaps among more conservative Catholics, where that's just not an area that they have chosen. And I think some of it is related to a personal responsibility issue, which is when coming from a heart overflowing with charity is something that is legitimate to bring up with someone that you get to know. But it is in the getting to know. And so so if you're going to go down, for example, if I were to take my entire family down to the homeless shelter and serve soup one weekend, I would be too busy chasing children to really be receptive to those people. Which is not to say, that those who do bring their children down there, but there is a certain, if you're leaving your community, if you're leaving your home to go forward into that inner city area, then you need to ask yourself hard questions about, am I doing this because Jesus is sending me, or am I doing this because I really want to?
Yeah, and again, it's learning your own calling and your own gifts and where God has planted you. And yes, sadly, the reputation that man referenced is true. It's often dichotomy, and social action is often equated with the liberal. Because sadly, sometimes it's hard to keep the balance of what does faith mean and what do works mean and how do they fit together.
Now, the really radical call, if you ask me, is to understand that you are called to live in that community, to be a part of that community, and to work for change in that very difficult inner city neighborhood. And that is something that we don't see a lot of people. And I'm not doing it right now, so I'm not preaching at, I understand the risks involved. And, for the time being, it does not seem to be God's will.
Let's take this last phone call, if we can here. Ruth from Virginia. And what ways can Virginia, hello. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi. Yes, Kristen. I was just wondering, in what ways, other than having children, can a layperson bear fruit for the Lord?
This is Ruth from your home state. Maybe you recognize. What do you think? What ways can a layperson be?
Ruth lives 2 doors down from me.
Oh, gee, this was a setup.
I think that the biggest witness for a mother today, really, at least, I guess I'm thinking from my perspective, I realize that I have a few more children than some people have, but to go into the grocery store with my children and to try really hard not to scream at them and, just to go forward and live our lives. And I think that we tend to discount how being kind to other people, even walking down the street and not necessarily training your children, is that it would be very inappropriate to say, look at that man and smile at him, that would be, but to treat homeless people as people, to treat, and to model that for your children, and then to model that to anyone, to everyone.
Helping our children understand the plight of the poor, and given the culture we live in, but also understanding it outside of our culture, the poor in South America, the poor in other parts of the world, which we only know through reading the newspaper or books or the media.
And children are so generous. To share that story with them, and maybe during Lent to say, what shall we give up? What little thing? And then save that money and send it over is a very concrete thing, because in reality, we are one of the richest nations in the world.
One last, because we got maybe a minute here.
Okay.
How has becoming a Catholic helped you grow closer to Jesus?
Oh, well, it helps very much that I get to see him every day. I think that the real growth has been in understanding what a beggar I am, and to know that I do have faults, and I do have sins, and that I can take those to him, and he makes it okay. He heals me. He encourages me. He strengthens me in a very incarnate way. And I need that. I think everyone does. To really have that, so you can touch him and you can allow him to touch you. So,
and to touch through you to other people. Kristen, thank you for being on the journey home.
Thank you.
It's been a long time. We've talked about this for a long time, and it's been a great pleasure. And I hope we all can take it seriously about our call to reach out to the poor and to recognize that we're all beggars at the table. Please stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment for some final thoughts for the journey home. It's been good meeting with Kristen tonight. It's a reminder to me and to all of us that we need to look at the aspect of charity that is in our hearts and in our lives. It's an aspect of our faith that we know is a central part of it, but which we can take for granted. Maybe we think we love enough, but can we ever love enough? When she mentioned and called herself beggar at the table, it reminded me that maybe the most significant thing I've learned in becoming Catholic, as I told her earlier, was how dumb and dense I am, and how so much I have to learn about what it truly means to follow Jesus Christ. It means, as John the Baptist said, that he must increase, I must decrease as we grow in our ability to live out our faith and reaching out to other people. More than almost anything we do is our need to reach out. A couple things from the Catechism as I close tonight. In paragraph 822 under the heading Charity, it says, charity is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for his own sake and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. There's a lot in that one sentence. It reminds us that charity is a gift of God to us. Our ability to love is a gift of his grace, changing us. The only reason we love God is because he loved us first. It changes us. And the reason we're called to love God above all things is for his own sake. Kristen was talking about early on she was serving, in reality for her own sake. We're called to recognize the blindness and self-centeredness in our own lives so that we can give for him. And then we're called to love. That's the work of the journey home as we walk together, living out our faith in charity for one another. God bless. I'll see you next week.